Today we're going to venture into some unknown territory and explore some new joinery techniques while building a chair worthy of the title, The Perfect Lounger. Or at least that's the plan. I'm Timber Biscuit. Alright, so for this chair, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to skip over milling my lumber because I think you guys have seen enough of that throughout my videos and jump right into the build. So for this one, I'm going to be using some 8/4 walnut that's been milled down to 1 7/8. And these pieces that you see me laying out here are going to make up the side profile for my modern lounger. Now, I'm taking a bit of a different approach to the joinery on this piece, so I need to make sure that I extend my templates out to make room for some tenons. And we'll dive more into what I'm going to do with those in a little bit. But so we're all on the same page, let's take a moment to dive into the design. Now, if you watched the last video, I built a table and cabinet fusion, so the overall design for this chair is heavily inspired by that table, as you can see by the nice sweeping curves. Now, just like last time, this is just a rough-ish sketch. I'm not a huge fan of fully committing to something in a sketch. I'd rather flesh those ideas out in the shop. And I promise throughout the video we'll cover more of the details, but at least now you have an idea of what we're going for. So getting back to it, the next step in the process was to cut out all of my pieces. And to do that, I'm just going to rough them out over at the bandsaw. Here I'm just cutting as close as I can to my templated line while making sure not to cut into it. Now earlier when I was laying out these pieces, I was really focused on the grain pattern. I laid out all my parts to find the straightest grain for each section. Now while that's not 100% necessary and maybe you don't want to do it for every piece, I think for this one it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of straight lines as well as some subtle curves that I try to use the grain pattern to follow. And overall I think it will result in a more cohesive piece. And if not, I'll just try cutting it in half by looking at it. I did it once. Saw it with my own eyes. Alright, so the next step was to slap my templates back onto my rough cut pieces using some double-sided tape. From there I can use a template bit and my router table to trim out the templates. Now what I'm going for here is just a small groove around all of my pieces. I find that this is both the easiest and the safest way to trim out templates. In the past I've used a large flush trim bit to flush trim these out fully from the get-go, but I find that that's less consistent than doing it this way. Especially with a piece like this where the radius of the curves is kind of tight and there's a lot of end grain. The good thing about using a small pattern bit is that there's less stress on it and it results in a smoother, less chattery cut. Now you'll probably notice here that again I'm not tracing out the complete ends of my template. And that's again because I want to make sure that I leave space for my mortise and tenon joinery. On the pieces that are going to have tenons, I've eyeballed about 1.5 inches of extra space so that I have plenty of real estate to mark those tenons out. So now that I've got that groove carved into all my pieces, I'm just using a tall flush trim combination bit to flush everything out. And I've talked about this a ton, but a compression bit does a great job with end grain, so I think it works perfectly for this application. Before I forget, if you guys want templates and plans for this project, let me know down in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. And don't worry, you don't need to use mortise and tenon, you could use dowels or dominoes. Alright, so the next step in the process was to lay out those tenons. And for some of the tenons, I'm going to be going with 3/4 inch long tenons, while other tenons are going to have 1 inch long tenons. And that's just because of the nature of the stress that they're going to receive. On the backrest, for instance, I want to have a longer tenon than I do for the side rails. And that's just because the backrest of a chair receives the most stress out of any of the joints. So now that I've marked out the tenon length, I'm just going to take the pieces back over to my bandsaw and trim them down. I'm not looking for these to be perfect here, because I can always finesse these fits later on, but I'm trying to get as close as I can. So the tenons marked out and trimmed down, the next step in the process was to find the center for each of them. And that's going to just include a little bit of measuring and math. Now this part of the process is super important, because all of our joints are going to be laid out based off of this mark. So here I really made sure to take my time and really double and even triple check my math. Because while laying out domino and dowel joinery can be tricky, laying out mortise and tenon joinery is a little bit harder, because you don't have the luxury of butting your two pieces against each other to find the center point. And if you don't get it right, just like an unemployment joke, they don't work. Alright, so with that, it brings me to my new joinery process that we talked about in the opening of the video. And that's going to be cutting mortise and tenon joinery using a PantoRouter. Now you may have seen a PantoRouter before, but this is my first time ever owning one, and I literally got it hours before shooting this video. Now to be clear, this isn't a sponsored video, I just really wanted a PantoRouter, and I felt like it would be perfect for this project. Plus I can see its versatility in a ton of other applications, so for me it was a good investment. And since I purchased it myself, you're going to get an honest opinion on it anytime I use it. So with that out of the way, let me talk a little bit about how it works for those of you who are unaware. In a nutshell, the machine works off of a pivot system. Then that pivot system is locked down to a base and a frame that swings within an allowed space. And you can confine that space using templates that are attached to the machine. And basically you use a post with a bearing to follow that template, which guides the cutter for the router around the workpiece. The result is a really accurate machine that allows me to do repeatable cuts based off the template. Now all this is super accurate when you're able to use the fences to align your workpiece. But because my pieces are offset angles that have rounded corners, I'm not able to utilize any of those tools for these cuts. So instead what I did was use the tip of a centering bit to locate my workpiece. Because the table and router are locked in place, they follow the same plane. So as long as my workpiece is centered and my bit follows my marking line from front to back, I know that they're going to match up. And the result will give me a centered tenon based off exactly where my measurement was. Now honestly, I'm not sure if that's how they fully intend for this type of machine to work, but it worked great for my application. And as you can see here from our initial mortises, everything's dialed in nice and tight, so we'll keep these settings exactly the same for the remainder of these tenons. Now my first set of leg tenons are all going to be single tenons, but we're going to do some double tenons and some larger tenons on some of my other parts. And if you're digging this dive on a modern way to build a modern chair, be sure to give this video a like so it can spread to more people. I appreciate your support. Alright, so with the first set of mortise and tenon joinery all wrapped up, I could test out all of my fits and see if anything needed to be adjusted. Now right off the machine, these were about 95% of the way there, with 2 tenons needing to be shaved down. But with that being said, we're looking alright. Alright, so the next step was to work on my smaller set of double mortise and tenon joints. And these are going to go in my 2 legs as well as the side rails. Here, because there's a lot more space on the side rails, I felt like it was a good opportunity to utilize the double mortise and tenon joint. Now the rails aren't going to receive a ton of stress, but I still think this is a good use case for a dual mortise and tenon. Which I gotta say, after a little bit of testing and setup, was about as easy as doing a single. I think the most challenging part of all of this was just keeping track of the depths of each of my mortise and tenons. Because like I mentioned earlier, they're gonna vary depending on their placement. It's just a lot to be mindful of. So again here, I color code all of my joints to make sure that I'm lining them up correctly, and I double and triple check my notes to make sure I'm cutting the right size joint on the right part. And once I had all of my joints cut, I could test the fit. And what I found was that one of my rails was about 1/8 of an inch longer than it was supposed to be. So what I did was mark out where that end should be and then recut it. Now because there was already tenons in this side, I thought it was going to be kind of tricky to get everything realigned, but in actuality, it wasn't that bad. I just followed the same process that I did for my initial setup and everything lined up perfectly. I think that really highlights the accuracy and repeatability portion of the machine. I will also say that if I was cutting these at the table saw, like I would do if I was doing domino joinery, I wouldn't have run into this issue. So that's definitely something to look at if you're looking at this machine. Like the guy who stole my selfie stick. You need to take a long look at yourself. Alright, so next on my list was to clean up some of these mortise and tenon joints. A few of the shoulders were a little offset because the angles weren't as perfect as they would be if they came directly off the table saw, and that's just because I didn't have any jig to set these up. When you use something like a sled, you can get repeatability on your cuts that are going to be exactly the same every single time. But with that, you give up the ease and speed that you can cut fun joinery like this. So again, that's one of those things that you have to weigh as a pro and a con. For me, it only takes a couple minutes in a plane to finesse those angles, and if I was forced to choose, I'd pick the traditional joinery. Now, all this isn't to say that I'm not going to go back to using a domino. In fact, in this build, I will use a domino, but I think ultimately, it just gives me a lot more options. And I love having options. Like when my friend told me to make myself at home at his new house, I threw him out. I can't stand having visitors. And that's just a joke. I love having you guys around. And speaking of which, if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more projects, be sure to stick around and subscribe. I make new videos about woodworking projects, tips, and tricks all the time, so subscribe so you don't miss the next one. So with that last cut, the legs and rails were all done, and I could go ahead and glue them up. Now, the majority of the strength from a mortise and tenon joint comes from the grain direction of your 2 parts. And what that means is that the crossing pattern between the 2 grains are what really create the strength. With that being said, I still like to add glue to the end grain, which acts as a straw sucking the glue in, as well as glue to the part that I'm gluing my tenon to. This way it increases the surface area, which is the goal for all these types of joints, and gives me a stronger bond. Now, with all my glue ups, I practice before I do the actual glue up itself. And that was especially important with this one, because I had to add a couple of miter clamp pieces to hold my clamps in place at the correct angle. And if you don't have these miter clamp tools, you could also just use offcuts that have complementary angles. So with the legs and clamps and while my glue dried, I went ahead and turned my attention to the armrest. Now, my armrest is going to have 2 separate sections. One is going to be where the palm sits, and that's just going to be the same thickness as the rest of the chair sides. Towards the back, however, I want to build in a transition. One that will taper outward and give more space for your elbows. You know, somewhere to throw them bows. So what I need to do here is just use my chisel to create a nice 90-degree crisp edge for where that transition will start. So all I do is use a hold down and then mark out where that 90 degrees is going to be, and then just use my chisel and a mallet to square everything off. Here I'm just careful to do one side and then flip my workpiece over to avoid that blowout that would occur if I went all the way through the workpiece. And then after a couple of taps, I can shave everything down and check the fit. Now you've probably noticed that I don't have these armrests cut yet, but that's okay. I'll just use a square piece of plywood to check to make sure that everything's nice and flush, and when it looks like it is, we're good. From there I'll take my workpiece over to my oscillating spindle sander. This will allow me to really smooth out those curves and remove any of the cut marks that were left by the router bit. I like to first start with my larger diameter drum and then work my way down to the smaller ones. This way I can really smooth out those lines and work my way down to the finer details. Now in hindsight, I should have done this step before I glued the legs together, but we're going to do those as one large piece later on anyway, so I'll make sure that everything gets nice and sanded. It would have just been easier to get into those tighter angles if they weren't already assembled. So the next step was to glue the armrest onto our leg assemblies. And to do that, I'm just going to do the same thing, putting glue in the mortise as well as on the tenon and the shoulder, and then clamping everything up. This was a lot easier because everything was already set to 90, so I just had to apply a couple clamps, squeeze everything nice and tight, and take an hour lunch. Like when I ate that clock yesterday. It was time consuming, especially when I went back for seconds. But seriously, all jokes aside, I'd say we're looking good. And I guess I just did. So with my two sides 80% assembled, I went back over to the spindle sander and smoothed out those curves we talked about earlier. Now these two transitions at the top were offset by like a 1/16 of an inch, so I just used the spindle sander to re-smooth out those curves and reshape them. From there I could set up another conspicuous clamping situation and attach the backrests. Now again, these are the extra large long tenons, so I want to make sure I got plenty of glue on them, but not so much that I'm going to blow out the joints. One other big difference between a domino and a mortise and tenon joint is that a domino has grooves plus a little extra space within the mortise itself to help avoid blowing out the joint. You don't have as much of a safety net when it comes to mortise and tenon joinery, so you just want to be careful. Then I can throw on 2 clamps and squeeze them nice and tight. From there I could get to work on the backrest and seat slats. Now again, I've already milled these to the correct thickness, but what I'm going to do is just run them over my joiner real quick to get a nice fresh edge on them. From there I'll take my pieces over to the table saw and rip them down into 3-inch wide strips. Now if you do decide to build this chair and you want to make the center wider or smaller, you can change the width of these slats. I just went with 3-inch wide strips because I felt like that was going to give me the most strength. You could probably get away with doing 2.5-inch wide strips as well if you need to make it narrower. For me, the width of the seat is going to be 21 inches, so 3 is divisible by 7, and I feel like it just makes sense. Even if there's only going to be 6 slats. Don't overthink it. Alright, so with the man glitter removed, I could go ahead and swap in my ripping blade for a crosscut blade. Now to cut all my strips down to their final length, I'm just going to use my miter gauge. So what I'll first do is trim off one end to make sure that I'm starting off with a square end. Then I'll flip the pieces over, butt them up against my stop, and cut them down to their final length. Now it's important to remember that I'm going to be cutting tenons on the end of my slats. So I'm going to make sure that I overcut all of my pieces by 2 inches. This gives me enough room for a 1-inch tenon on each end of my slats, which will be plenty strong for the seat and backrest. Now because I change the setup on my miter gauge so frequently, I just use a rule to make sure that my stop is set to the correct length. If you don't change all the settings on yours as frequently as I do, you don't have to worry about this step, but I figured I'd just add that in as a tip. Alright, so next it was time to head back over to the PantoRouter to cut in the mortises and then trim out our tenons. Now for the mortises on my cap pieces, they're only going to be a 1/4 inch thick. So the first thing I needed to do was swap in my 1/2-inch bit for a 1/4 inch one. And then from there I can use some stops and the auxiliary fence to set the center of the cut. And again, the cool thing about this machine is that once everything is really dialed in, it's easy enough to just slide the auxiliary fence up or down, depending on where I need to put my mortise. So this whole process is super smooth. And as you can see, it's pretty fast. So with all the slat mortises cut, I could go ahead and cut the adjoining tenons. And to do that, I'm going to use this handy little jig that acts as a stop to set the depth of the workpiece. This way I can repeat the depth on all of my other pieces, knowing that I only have to set the machine up once for 1 inch and that all my tenons are going to be the exact same length. And because we can right now, let's take a look at that machine in action in slow motion. Alright, I think that's enough slow motion. Let's speed things up. Actually, that's a little too fast. Let's go ahead and slow it back down. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Nice. Done. Alright, so with all the slow-mo tenons cut, I could go ahead and assemble the slatted seats and see how everything was fitting. And right off the machine, I'd say they were again 95% there. I did go back and use my shoulder plane to clean up a few that were a bit tight, but nothing too major. Next, it was time to cut out my armrest as well as my lower chair rail. So just like before, I looked at my grain pattern to find something that really complemented the curves as well as fell into those straight lines. And luckily for the taper on the armrest, there was a small knot in the board that went right with the curve, so I felt like the board was just beckoning to be the armrest. And for the chair rail, I'm only going to cut out one that just goes on the front of the chair. I played with the design on putting one on the front and on the rear of the chair, but I don't think they actually need to be there. However, I think that the front one really ties everything together from a design standpoint, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments. If you like the chair rail in the front, comment, yes, chair rail. If you don't, say no chair rail. And don't worry, you won't hurt my feelings if you don't like it. And for all of you that start out your comment with yes and no chair rail, I'll reply to your comments first because as always, I know you guys are paying attention. Alright, so my 2 armrests and chair rail trimmed out over at the router table, I can take my armrest back over to the table saw and trim the ends square. Again, we want to make sure these are nice and square so they meet up well with our chair side armrests. Next was finally time to trim down the legs to their final length. And to do that, I'm just going to use my track saw. And this is the reason why I've kept my legs oversized till now. Because it's a lot easier to trim both legs as one whole piece than it is to trim each leg one at a time. Another option would be to build a sled and cut these flat over at the table saw. But a track saw does just as well, so that's the route I went. So once I've trimmed one side to its final length, I take that piece and lay it on top of my other side and then mark out the location for the cut. This ensures that both my sides will sit at the same height and everything will align for the rest of the project. The one thing to be mindful of here is that these cuts are going to set the angle on your chair. So if you want these to have a relaxed, laid back look, then you want to allow them to have a steeper angle, which is what I'm going for on this chair. So with both sides cut, I could sandwich them together and tilt them up so I could get a better look. Oops, sorry, let me get you a better view. Thank you, Pat Shane. Alright, so next it was time to lay out the joinery for the seat and backrest. Now the layout for this part was quite tricky, because I had to locate all of these markings in space, which we've gone over in other videos when I've covered the domino. So I'll sum up that 2.5 hours of layout time in the shop into the 15 seconds that you just watched. And with my domino set up, I can go ahead and cut in the mortises for my floating tenons. Now you may be wondering why I chose to go with the domino rather than the PantoRouter for this section of the build. And the easy answer for that is that it's due to the size of these pieces and the location of the mortises. The mortises that I'm plunging here would be pretty difficult to get to on the PantoRouter. Now I could have done these before I assembled the whole chair, but I feel like that's pretty risky. There's a chance that things don't line up, and I just don't think that that's worth the risk. And I can tell you that it's not worth the risk because I ran into that exact issue even though I'm using the domino. So even though I went through that whole 2.5 hours of layout, I left one side of my backrest undetermined. And that was because my plan was to cut all my dominoes and then assemble the piece and then mark out the location for the other side of the backrest once everything was assembled. Then I could take everything apart and plunge those dominoes, which you just saw me do, but I missed by about 1/4 of an inch. So instead I had to go back and plug all those holes with some pieces that I cut to the size of dominoes. And honestly, there was a little frustration there, but if I didn't put that into a YouTube video, you'd probably never know they were there. And that's because the majority of those plugs are going to be hidden by the actual backrest. So all of that's to say that it's much easier to cut these mortises with a domino than it is with a PantoRouter, but there's still a challenge. And that whole situation was like reading a horror story in Braille. It felt like something bad was coming, but I couldn't see it at all. Alright, so next I could focus my attention on that front rail. And since my rail is going to meet up with my slats in the front, I need to cut a bevel on it that matches the front angle of my legs. Now to be fully honest with you, at this point I have no idea what this angle is. I just use my bevel gauge to grab the angle off the front of the leg, and then just set my table saw blade to that exact angle. From there I just use a featherboard to help keep my piece against the fence while I cut it, and give it a light trim. Then I could check the fit and clamp my piece in place so that I could lay out the dominoes. Here I'll just reference off a small tick mark that I'll put on the leg as well as the front rail. And then from there I could grab the domino and plunge in my last mortises. And hey Shane, you got a little something there on your shirt. And with that last plunge, the joinery portion of this build is complete. So from there we really need to finesse and fine tune these pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is clean up all the edges of my slats. And to do that, I'm just going to use my number 4 smoother. What this does is it removes all those saw marks and gives me a nice smooth edge for the router table when we cut the roundovers in a second. And a lot of you may be thinking, why would you worry about planing them if you're just going to round them over? And the answer to that is that we want to start out with the best surface we can for all of our processes. So hand planing all these saw marks is going to leave us with a smoother edge for that bearing to ride against, which will ultimately give us a better roundover. And woodworking all those little steps combined for a better product. Next I could drop in my 1/4 inch roundover bit over at the router table. And what I'm going to do is give all my slats a 1/4 inch roundover on all 4 sides, while making sure to avoid any of the joints that are going to come in contact with the chair sides. We don't want to round those over, we want them to be nice and flat, which is why you saw me hand planing those earlier too. Oh, and before I forget, if you guys want to follow all the processes I do in the shop and stay up to date on what's going on, be sure to follow me over on Instagram at TimberBiscuitWoodwork. That'll keep you in the loop. So with all my roundovers sanded down, I could go ahead and glue all my slats in place. And to do that, I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier, where we apply a little glue into the mortise, a little glue on the tenon, and then pop everything in place. Now the one thing I'll say is that gluing up 6 mortise and tenon joints at one time was a little stressful only because I didn't want the glue to start setting up before I got everything done. And if I wasn't trying to use a dark wood glue to help conceal some of that squeeze out, I would use something like Titebond to extend, where it would give me a little bit more working time. And again, we've covered that in past videos, but for now we'll stick with the dark stuff and get it done. Whew. From there I can just repeat that same process on the larger seat portion, and that'll be a wrap on the slats. Unfortunately on this one, I did snag myself a splinter. But don't worry, it's just like when I ran into that lamp post. It was a light injury. So while the glue set up on those, I went ahead and sanded all the parts for my sides. Now here I had to hand sculpt the top of the chair just so that it had a nice natural flow, and then I traced out the profile onto the other chair and followed that same line. And since all that took about an hour, I had plenty of time to pop the clamps off the slats and give them a quick sanding. And then from there I could flush up any of the edges that may have shifted a bit during the glue up. Next it was time to add the roundover profile to the edges of the remaining chair parts. Now this part was a little tricky because there was some parts that I needed to avoid, so I just used some blue tape to give myself an indicator to avoid those areas. We don't want to round over the parts where the armrest is going to meet up because then we would have a weird gap there. Also, because the diameter of the bearing is a bit wider than those corners, we're going to have to round those over by hand, which we'll go over here in just a second. But while I wrap up some of those finishing touches, let me just take a moment to say that if you guys are enjoying these videos and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes for plans and merch, some other free stuff, and an invite to the Discord server, where we chat about what you guys got going on, what I got going on, and monthly live chats. Plus, I'm always trying to figure out other ways to get you guys involved, so if that's something you're interested in, check out the link in the description. And again, to all those who've already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your contributions go directly towards making these videos. Alright, back to the details. So to get in those tight corners we talked about earlier, I'm just going to use a really small rasp to round over those edges. This will taper them down and tuck them in pretty nicely. Then from there I can turn my attention towards the feet. Now we've gone over this in pretty much every furniture piece that I've ever built, but I think it's super important to highlight again that we want to chamfer those feet. And I'm thinking about making that a t-shirt, something funny about furniture foot fetish, but I don't know, let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in. So once I completed the tear out prevention, I could go ahead and glue on the armrest. And I'm just going to use some blue tape here to avoid any of that squeeze out that might get tucked underneath that armrest, because cleaning it up from that angle could be a bit of a challenge. So with a healthy amount of glue applied, I could stick on the armrest and apply a couple clamps to hold everything in place. Now gluing face to an edge this wide was a little bit slippery, so I just took my time and went one clamp at a time. I don't use any seasoning in my shop, that's for dinner. So with the clamps removed, I could sand everything flush and round over any remaining edges. Then from there I could apply my mark and it was time for the glue up. And I was going to put a joke about a boomerang in here, but I forgot it. Don't worry, it'll come back to me. From there we could go ahead and glue everything together. Now because I already glued the tenons into the seat and backrest, this came together pretty easily. Again, all I did was apply a little glue to the mortise and tenon and squeeze everything together with some clamps. Which is great because we're on the home stretch. And that was about as intense as I thought it was going to be. So for the finish on the chair, I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat Pure. And that's again because that's the same finish we used on the table in the last build, and we want these finishes to match. Not to mention, from that project we have some left over, so it makes sense to use it. So the application goes exactly the same way, where we water pop everything, then sand up to 180 grit lightly, vacuum it all down, and then apply a little bit of mineral spirits. This really smooths out that surface and gives us a nice clean area to work with. And then from there I can mix 3 parts of part A to 1 part of part B and combine. The application for Rubio Monocoat is super easy. I just use a Scotch-Brite pad to apply it, and then wait about 10 minutes and wipe everything off with a shop towel. Once it was dry, I could add the cushions my wife made and cue the beauty shots. I, for one, absolutely love this chair. I think the grain pattern flows really nicely between each section, and it really emphasizes that linear lean. The curves are subtle and intentional, and I feel like everything makes sense with this piece. The extruded armrests give a nice landing pad for the elbow, and I feel like that front rail really helps to pull everything together. Not to mention, I really dig that subtle overhang on the chair seat. The curved handrails work really well for getting up and down from this low lounger, which is great because no one wants to put a bunch of effort in when they're trying to relax. That's like using a double negative, a big no-no. So if you enjoyed this build and you want to see others like it, make sure you subscribe. Check out this video over here next, and like always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.